you can think about this. I think it's worth thinking about, because I think this is how we think of each other. And I think this is how we treat each other. And I think this is what we upbraid ourselves for when we fail. You wake up in the morning, and what is it that confronts you? Now, you could say that it's the material reality of the circumstances around you, and that you're driven like clockwork by that. But that isn't how it appears phenomenologically, I don't believe. I don't see that that's how we see ourselves when we awaken in the morning. What we see in front of us is a field of potential, constrained to a large degree for some of us and wider for others, but still definitely present. And that's the domain of what could be that day. And I think the day is the right level of analysis. And you wake up and you confront the world and you think, well, here's a variety of ways that things could play themselves out today. And that's that field of potential that's in front of you. It could go this way, or it could go this way, or it could go that way. And you know that maybe you have difficult decisions ahead of you. And you know that perhaps you're motivated to avoid some of them, or maybe not to take the difficult decision, but to take the easy way out. And you have some inkling of how things would go if you did it properly, or if you avoided it, or if you took the easy way out. You can understand how the future would be likely to unfold if you took any of those patterns of action. And then you get up and you decide to act or to not act in accordance with your decisions. And as a consequence, you turn the potential that characterizes the future into the actuality of the present and the past. And so to me, what that means is that whatever your consciousness is, which in the oldest sense is the thing that has, what would you say? It's that which dwells within you, that's made in the image of the God who created things at the beginning of time. That's the idea, is that the implementation of that transforms the chaotic potential that confronts you in the form of the indeterminate future into the actual world. And that's what we do. And we do that as a consequence of our moral choices. And in Genesis, the claim is that insofar as God used the logos to perform exactly the same function, then the habitable order that was created was good. And that's insisted upon repeatedly. And so there's a deep ethic there, and it's a very deep ethical idea. And the idea is that it's possible, you have within your grasp the possibility to take the world despite its suffering and its malevolence, and to confront it in a manner that, as a consequence of applying truth, will transform what you produce out of that potential into what is good. And that's a call for a particular form of ethical being. And it's on you. Is that you make decisions to go this way or that way, and some of the decisions lead up to something that's positive, and some of the decisions lead down to something that's negative. And if enough of us make the decision to move down into what's negative, then that's exactly what happens. And we create situations around us that are so close to hell that the distinction is merely semantic. And so you might say, well, you're no believer in heaven, and perhaps you're no believer in God, but you could easily be a believer in the ability of your own cowardly indecision and determination to use deceit instead of confronting things courageously and truthfully to produce something around you that's hell for all intents and purposes. And I think that that was the lesson of the 20th century. I think that's exactly what happened. I think that the reason it happened is because individuals abandoned their moral responsibility. And that moral responsibility is, in some sense, absolute enough to be unbearable. Having said that, so then my conclusion, because of all that, and for other reasons as well, was that, well, it was true that life is suffering tainted by malevolence, but that there was a power of spirit that characterized the human being that enabled him or her to confront that forthrightly with nobility of purpose, and to transcend the suffering and constrain the malevolence, and that was within our grasp. And that what that meant fundamentally was that despite the undeniable structural reality of finitude and evil, that the spirit of the human being was so powerful in its potential that that could be confronted and accepted as a fundamental responsibility, and then transcended and repaired as a consequence. And so that was an inversion of the most pessimistic possible view, I suppose, which is that life is ineradicably suffering and malevolence, into the opposite view, which is that if that is taken on voluntarily, then it's something that can be transcended and rectified. And that's the sacred responsibility of every single person. And worse, that the abdication of that responsibility, which is in some sense virtually unbearable in its weight, that the abandonment of that or the avoidance of it produces a void in the structure of reality that's filled by something that's hellish. And so it's not only that you fail to make things better when you could by stopping doing the things that you know to be wrong, but that if you don't take forthright action, then the space you leave is filled by something that's dreadful. And so the conclusion of all that was that the collectivists were wrong, and those who insisted that the individual was the sovereign foundation of the state, and that each individual has a divine element that's the rationale for that foundational sovereignty and the reason for our equality before God and the law, that's correct in the most fundamental of ways. And so what I've been attempting to do since then, and I guess that's part of the reason why you're all here, I suppose, is to suggest to individuals that there's far more to you than you would like to believe. And that whether you manifest that in the world properly makes far more difference than you would like to imagine. And the downside of that is the crushing weight of that voluntary adoption of your moral burden. But the upside is the discovery of the nobility that's within you, that's of sufficient force and power to be aligned in some sense with the most fundamental realities of the world, and that constitutes a sufficient wellspring of strength, if drawn upon properly, for you to bear the suffering and malevolence that characterizes the world without becoming corrupted as a consequence. In any case, so you can imagine the hell you could inhabit. And then the advantage to that is people are often afraid of moving forward, and no wonder. But you should be way more afraid of not moving forward. And so if you get that hell behind you, it's like, well, do I want to go there? Well, I don't have the effort or the energy. I'm not even sure that it's the right thing. It's like, well, do I want to go back there? It's like, no, definitely not that. And if you don't feel that, hell, then you're not nearly as motivated as you could be. Because if you have any sense of just exactly how bloody dismal and dark things could get, then, and that's right there for you. And that was one thing that...
I thought it was helpful. I thought it was helpful when I did the future authoring to think about where I would go if I went to the wrong place.
Why?
Well, it's just good to know how you will fall apart.
Yeah, well,
that
and then
it's
you
possible?
can. Well, and you can also ask yourself, and studying historical atrocity also helped me with that. It's like, well, do you want to be a what would you call a sadist? You're bitter and resentful. You want to hurt other people? Is that where you want to end up? You want to lie and deceive? Because that's where you end up if you lie and deceive. You want to be resentful and bitter? Because that's where you end up if you're resentful and bitter.
Yeah, but sometimes, people, they just don't know what to do about it. So your program helps them to make a plan.
Yeah, well, and the plan is really, look, we're visionaries, man. Human beings are visionaries. Really.
Well, I found when I did the self-authoring, the 15 minutes of writing that I did, the dreaming I did,
Yeah.
when I wrote about my future and just dreamed of what it could be like if it was just what I wanted.
Yeah.
And then outlined the goals, because you outline goals after that in the
Yeah.
future authoring. Those things that I had identified appeared in my life.
Yeah, well,
and that was quite shocking to
well,
me.
the thing is, you look at the world through a goal-directed framework. And so when you switch your goals, what appears to you in the world switches. It's mystical in a sense, but in another sense, it's just understandable. It's like, well, if I look that way, I see the TV and the couch, and if I look this way, I see you in the chair. Well, that's not that mysterious, but what I've done is I've changed the reality that manifests itself to me just by changing the direction of my orientation. Well, we do that metaphysically as well. And so, for example, if you decide that you're going to be courageously trusting towards people when they offer you an opportunity, even though you're skeptical and timid, but you decide, no, I'm going to have some faith in people, so I'm going to be courageous and trusting, then when they open a door to you that's an opportunity, you'll think, oh, that's a door I could walk through, instead of thinking I'm moving into a trap. And it's the same reality in some sense, but the way that you're interacting with it changes. Well, it can change. It can invert. It can change so radically that it barely looks like you're living in the same world. There are a lot of potential interpretations that you can validly lay on the world. And some of them are extremely positive, and they still work. And wouldn't that be lovely if you could lay an incredibly positive vision on the world in a calculating and strategic manner, not an instrumental manner, right? Because you're aiming at something genuinely good, and that would work. And that is how the world works. One of the things I loved about my clinical practice, I loved this. It was so good, and I miss it. We are always working. The best parts of me and my client were working together to make everything about their lives better. And it worked. Like I had lots of female clients who tripled their income in 4 years. They didn't even think that was possible. It's like, well, I don't make enough money. I'm barely making ends meet, single mothers. I have no idea what to do. I don't like my job. It's like, well, let's make a plan here. What do you want? Well, I'd like to make this much money. Why don't we double that? And just because you're going to aim at something. Some people do make more money than that, so maybe it could be you. Well, is that even possible? It's not even possible. It's like, well, let's just assume that maybe it's possible and see what you'd have to do. Well, you got to get your CV together. Well, it's full of holes. Okay, well, let's fix the holes. Okay, now you got to get a plan. Well, I'm not very good at interviews. Okay, let's practice interviewing till you're not just good at it, you're looking forward to it. I had clients who were in such dire situations that all I could do was really help buffer them against that. But they were a minority. I wouldn't say more than 5% of my practice fell into that category. Everyone else, it was like just rapid improvement on all fronts, And that's such fun. And there isn't anything more practical. This is the thing, too. There is nothing more practical than developing a vision. It's not some pie-in-the-sky exercise. Without a vision, you're chaotic and fragmented and hopeless and disappointed, and someone can stop you just by putting up a single obstacle. You're a house divided amongst itself. You have no forward movement. You're not enthusiastic, and that's to be filled with the Spirit of God, by the way. And your life is a sequence of disappointments and frustrations and tragedies, and you're a leaf blowing in the wind. And that is not what you're called to be. That's not what you're called to be. You're called to be a visionary constructor of the paradisal vision. Mm-hmm. Really? That's who you are. Terrible as that is to apprehend. And so,
Well, what do we have to lose?
we already will lose everything we have to lose.
Yeah.
Right? We're all in this game, man. So there's, whether you want it to be this way or not, you are betting everything on your life.